The shock didn't come from a missile launch or a midnight tweet. It came from a number, $780 billion, a figure so large it doesn't just move markets, it moves history. And when that number became attached to a strategic shift toward China, the political atmosphere in Washington ignited overnight. Cameras rushed into briefing rooms, analysts scrambled, allies leaned in, and at the center of the storm stood Donald Trump, facing a geopolitical tremor that threatened to redraw economic fault lines across North America. For weeks, whispers had circulated in financial circles that something massive was brewing north of the border. Trade officials in Canada had grown noticeably quieter. Energy executives canceled routine appearances. Investment committees held closed-door meetings that stretched long past midnight. Then the confirmation landed like a thunderclap. A reallocation package valued at $780 billion aimed at strengthening long-term trade, infrastructure alignment, and resource integration with Beijing. Markets dipped before they understood why. Energy futures jolted. Currency traders froze. The reaction from Trump was immediate and visceral. Advisors described the moment as electric, not panicked, but intense, the kind of intensity that surfaces when leverage shifts unexpectedly. For years, the United States had viewed Northern partnerships as stable pillars in its strategic architecture. Cross-border pipelines, Arctic resource exploration, defense cooperation, these were constants. Suddenly, that certainty felt thinner. Behind the scenes, strategists began mapping the potential impact zone, and one word kept surfacing: Alaska. The vast northern frontier, rich in energy reserves and strategic military positioning, sits closer to Asia than many Americans realize. It has long been both shield and bridge, a geographic hinge between continents. If Canada's capital and commodities began tilting eastward at scale, Alaska could find itself economically exposed and politically pressurized in ways unseen in decades. Trump's public posture was defiant. He framed the move as short-sighted, risky, and destabilizing. Yet insiders noted something more layered beneath the rhetoric: calculation. Because $780 billion is not just an investment, it's influence. It signals supply chain reorientation, shipping lane recalibration, long-term mineral contracts, and infrastructure that binds economies together for generations. The psychological message was just as potent as the financial one. Alliances are fluid, and loyalty follows opportunity. Meanwhile, Beijing's response was measured and almost serene. There were no grand celebrations, no inflammatory statements, just quiet affirmations about mutual growth and shared prosperity. That composure unsettled Washington more than fireworks ever could. Strategic patience has always been a defining trait of Chinese statecraft. A slow tightening of economic threads can prove more enduring than sudden confrontation. Within days, commentators began framing the situation as an escalation in U.S.-China tensions, but the reality felt more complex. This was not a tariff dispute or a sanctions exchange. It was a structural pivot, the kind that reshapes trade corridors and alters diplomatic gravity. If Canadian capital flowed eastward in sustained waves, American industries tied to northern cooperation, energy, rare earth minerals, Arctic shipping logistics would face recalibration. Alaska's leadership quickly convened emergency consultations. Energy executives assessed export alternatives. Indigenous community representatives demanded transparency about how shifting trade patterns could affect land rights and environmental safeguards. Military analysts evaluated Arctic readiness, because beyond economics lies security, and the Arctic has quietly transformed into a high-stakes theater of competition. Trump's messaging sharpened. He argued that American resilience would not hinge on any single partner. He emphasized domestic production, strategic independence, and the importance of reinforcing alliances that demonstrate reciprocity. The tone resonated with his political base, yet Wall Street remained cautious. Investors understand that supply chains are ecosystems. Disrupt one node, and ripple effects cascade unpredictably. Across the Pacific, Chinese markets interpreted the announcement as validation of long-term outreach efforts. Infrastructure initiatives, port expansions, energy procurement agreements, all part of a broader tapestry designed to deepen global interdependence on Beijing's terms. The $780 billion figure symbolized trust, and trust translates into sustained leverage. What made this moment particularly volatile was timing. Global markets were already navigating inflationary pressures and technological realignment. Semiconductor supply chains were being fortified domestically. Rare earth mineral sourcing had become a national priority. Any shift in northern alignment introduced new uncertainty precisely when stability was prized. Trump's critics suggested that confrontational rhetoric in prior years may have nudged Canada to diversify. His allies countered that diversification was inevitable in a multipolar economy. The truth likely resides somewhere between strategy and circumstance. Nations pursue advantage, leaders respond to incentives, and when numbers reach into the hundreds of billions, motivations extend beyond personalities. Alaska's energy corridors illustrate the complexity. Oil fields that once flowed predictably southward could face pricing pressure if alternative northern exports expand toward Asia. Liquefied natural gas terminals, already capital-intensive ventures, might compete against subsidized supply chains oriented across the Pacific. Employment projections shift with trade winds. Yet crisis narratives can obscure opportunity. Some American manufacturers saw the development as a catalyst to accelerate domestic mining and refining capacity. Investment funds began reallocating toward U.S.-based infrastructure modernization. If Canada strengthened ties eastward, perhaps Washington would double down inward. Trump's political instincts leaned into contrast. He portrayed the situation as a wake-up call, framing American industry as capable of unmatched innovation if unburdened. The message was less about retaliation and more about acceleration, building faster, drilling smarter, negotiating harder. Diplomats, however, operated in subtler registers. Quiet conversations unfolded between ambassadors. Assurances were sought, clarifications offered. Because even amid economic realignment, geographic proximity enforces cooperation. The border between the United States and Canada is not merely a line, it is an artery of commerce, culture, and defense. China's calculus remained strategic. Diversifying energy sources reduces vulnerability. Securing Arctic-adjacent partnerships expands shipping flexibility as polar ice patterns evolve. Embedding financial commitments of this magnitude weaves durable connections that transcend electoral cycles. That is the long game. For ordinary Americans watching headlines scroll, the drama felt distant yet unsettling. $780 billion is abstract until gasoline prices shift or retirement portfolios fluctuate. Economic statecraft ultimately lands on household budgets. Trump's inner circle reportedly examined contingency scenarios, tariff adjustments, incentives for domestic producers, diplomatic overtures to reinforce continental stability. The tone oscillated between toughness and pragmatism, because markets punish overreaction as swiftly as weakness. In Alaska, community forums filled quickly. Fishermen worried about export markets. Construction firms eyed infrastructure grants. Environmental advocates warned against accelerated drilling without safeguards. The state has always balanced abundance with fragility. Now that balance seemed newly precarious. Analysts cautioned against framing the situation as zero-sum. Canada's engagement with China did not automatically sever ties with Washington, yet scale matters. At $780 billion, the signal was unmistakable. Economic gravity can shift, and when it does, political narratives must adapt. Trump's communications team leaned into the optics of strength. Images of American manufacturing plants, energy rigs, and bustling ports dominated press briefings. The visual message, America builds, America leads, America responds. It was a reminder that perception shapes markets as powerfully as policy. Still, beneath the spectacle, strategic planners confronted a sobering question. If allies increasingly hedge between Washington and Beijing, what does leadership look like in a multipolar century? Is it dominance, partnership, resilience, or reinvention? The Arctic horizon, once peripheral in geopolitical discourse, now loomed central. Melting sea lanes shortened shipping routes between Asia and North America. Control over ports, pipelines, and mineral rights becomes exponentially more valuable. Alaska sits at that crossroads, both sentinel and stakeholder. Trump's rhetoric intensified around sovereignty and fair trade, yet he avoided immediate punitive measures, signaling awareness that escalation could compound volatility. Markets exhale when leaders demonstrate restraint. Canada's officials emphasized economic pragmatism. Diversification protects against downturns. Engaging Asia complements, not replaces, North American cooperation. Whether that reassurance satisfies Washington remains uncertain. The psychological dimension of this episode may prove as consequential as the financial one. Perceived slights can harden into policy shifts. Confidence, once shaken, demands rebuilding. And so the world watched as two continents recalibrated. A $780 billion figure reverberated through trading floors, diplomatic corridors, and Arctic coastlines. Trump stood before cameras projecting resolve. Beijing projected patience. Ottawa projected independence. Alaska projected concern and possibility in equal measure. History rarely announces itself with sirens. Sometimes it arrives as a spreadsheet, a signature, a reallocation entry that alters trajectories. The question is not merely whether Alaska faces economic fallout. The deeper question is whether this moment signals a broader reordering, one where alliances flex, influence diffuses, and the balance of power becomes less predictable, yet more interconnected than ever before. The days that followed did not bring explosions or immediate ruptures. Instead, they brought something subtler and arguably more powerful: recalculation. Financial institutions began modeling 10-year projections instead of quarterly reactions. Energy conglomerates reviewed shipping insurance premiums for Arctic passages. Defense analysts revisited cold weather deployment budgets. The atmosphere felt like the calm tension before a chess master commits to a decisive move. Within the White House orbit, discussions reportedly turned philosophical as well as practical. What does economic loyalty mean in an era of global capital mobility? If capital seeks efficiency, can patriotism compete with profitability? Trump's advisors framed the issue not as betrayal but as competition. Competition can be won. Betrayal implies permanence. Language matters when markets are listening. Alaska's ports suddenly appeared in think tank white papers with greater frequency. Their proximity to Asian routes became both asset and vulnerability. If Canadian infrastructure deepened its Pacific integration, would American ports accelerate upgrades to remain competitive? Would federal funding prioritize Arctic resilience? These were no longer theoretical questions. China's strategic patience continued to unsettle observers. There were incremental announcements about joint research initiatives, resource mapping collaborations, and digital trade facilitation, none individually seismic. Collectively, they painted a mosaic of long-term integration. Trump's public appearances emphasized American capacity for self-reliance. He highlighted domestic rare earth mining initiatives and semiconductor fabrication investments. The narrative, resilience over reliance. It was a message tailored not only to voters but to investors seeking confidence anchors. Meanwhile, Canadian officials reiterated that diversification enhances stability. They pointed to global demand curves and the necessity of engaging emerging markets. In private, some acknowledged that balancing relations among major powers requires agility and nerve. Alaska's business leaders adopted a pragmatic tone. Rather than lament potential losses, they explored joint ventures, export diversification, and value-added processing within state borders. Adaptation is embedded in frontier culture. As weeks unfolded, the immediate shock softened into strategic dialogue. Yet the underlying shift remained. $780 billion does not evaporate. It embeds itself in contracts, infrastructure, and expectations. The United States, long accustomed to gravitational centrality in continental economics, now faced a test of persuasive power. Could it maintain primacy through innovation and partnership rather than assumption? Trump's legacy has often been defined by disruption. Now disruption confronted him from abroad. His response would shape perceptions not only of strength but of adaptability. In the Arctic twilight, where pipelines trace frozen earth and cargo ships carve paths through thinning ice, the stakes felt tangible. Alaska embodies both abundance and exposure. Its future will depend not solely on decisions made in Ottawa, Beijing, or Washington, but on how deftly it navigates shifting currents. The $780 billion pivot may ultimately be remembered less as a rupture and more as a catalyst, a moment that forced North America to reassess its economic architecture in a world where influence flows along trade routes as powerfully as along military alliances. And so the narrative continues, not with finality, but with momentum. Markets adjust, leaders posture, citizens adapt. The world grows more interconnected even as it competes more fiercely. In that paradox lies the true drama of this unfolding chapter. What happens next will not be dictated by headlines alone, but by strategy measured in decades. And in that long horizon, resilience, innovation, and diplomacy will matter more than outrage. The number that stunned Washington may yet become the spark that refines it. What unfolded after the initial shock was not a retreat, not an apology, and not a dramatic reversal. It was something far more consequential: entrenchment. The $780 billion shift did not flicker like a headline, it settled like concrete. Contracts moved from draft to signature. Infrastructure blueprints transitioned into procurement phases. Financial institutions began structuring long-term instruments around the new trade architecture.
The realization dawned slowly in Washington that this was not leverage for negotiation. It was a directional commitment.
Inside political circles, the tone sharpened. Advisors close to Donald Trump began reframing the narrative from reaction to counter-strategy. Publicly, the emphasis remained on strength and economic sovereignty. Privately, the discussions revolved around timelines. How quickly could domestic energy output scale? How rapidly could supply chains pivot? How aggressively should the United States pursue parallel trade corridors to offset the gravitational pull of China? Markets, always allergic to uncertainty, stabilized but did not relax. Investors are comfortable with rivalry. They are uncomfortable with unpredictability. What they saw now was a structural realignment north of the border in Canada that could ripple across decades. Pension funds, sovereign wealth allocations, private equity, each recalculated exposure. Analysts began writing in longer paragraphs, using phrases like strategic decoupling, Arctic integration, and continental hedging. In Alaska, the conversation deepened from anxiety to urgency. Energy executives who once relied almost reflexively on cross-border assumptions now spoke about redundancy. Redundancy in export routes, redundancy in refining capacity, redundancy in diplomatic relationships. Because if capital can migrate eastward at scale, then dependence becomes vulnerability. Trump intensified his messaging around American industrial revival. He framed the moment as a turning point, a stress test revealing where the United States must reinforce itself. He invoked manufacturing plants, energy corridors, mineral independence, and advanced technology hubs. The underlying message was psychological as much as economic. America does not retreat, it rebuilds. Yet rebuilding demands coordination. Congressional leaders debated incentive packages. Governors advocated for infrastructure grants. Defense officials revisited Arctic strategy documents that had once gathered quiet dust. The northern frontier was no longer peripheral. It was strategic terrain in a broader competition for influence. Meanwhile, Beijing's posture remained disciplined. Statements emphasized mutual growth and long-term partnership. Trade delegations quietly expanded. Shipping logistics firms announced exploratory expansions of port capacity linked to Pacific routes. The choreography was deliberate, almost understated. No triumphalism, just methodical integration. In Canada, policymakers projected calm pragmatism. They insisted diversification was neither hostile nor exclusive. They described the shift as a necessary adaptation to global demand trends. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lay a clear signal: economic agency belongs to those willing to exercise it. The psychological impact on Washington proved subtle but real. For decades, continental economics operated under an assumption of alignment. Now that assumption required verification rather than presumption. Diplomacy shifted from maintenance to persuasion. Alaska's local leaders began courting federal attention more assertively. They highlighted the state's role as a strategic buffer and energy reservoir. They argued that federal investment in ports, icebreakers, and renewable research would not merely protect local jobs but fortify national resilience. Town halls filled with residents who understood instinctively that geography had thrust them into the center of a global recalibration. Trump's critics accused him of escalating tensions through rhetoric. His supporters countered that clarity deters drift. Both perspectives missed a deeper dynamic. Global capital responds less to speeches and more to structure, and the structure was shifting. Energy markets felt the tremors first. Futures contracts reflected new assumptions about supply diversity. Insurance premiums for Arctic shipping adjusted incrementally. Analysts tracked vessel traffic patterns with heightened scrutiny. The Arctic, once a remote afterthought for most Americans, became a focal point in strategic briefings. Within financial institutions, scenario planning accelerated. What if Canada's eastern orientation expanded beyond energy into technology? What if mineral extraction partnerships deepen? What if digital infrastructure followed capital flows? Each possibility introduced new variables. Trump responded with a blend of defiance and opportunity. He proposed accelerated domestic mining permits and emphasized rare earth independence. He highlighted semiconductor investments and artificial intelligence initiatives. The message was forward-facing. Competition breeds innovation. Still, beneath public confidence lingered a strategic dilemma. The United States thrives when alliances amplify its influence. If allies hedge, Washington must either outcompete or outcooperate. Choosing which path defines the next decade. China's approach seemed rooted in patience. Economic integration creates habits. Habits create dependency. Dependency creates leverage. It is a long arc, invisible in daily headlines, but profound over time. In Alaska, business leaders refused paralysis. They explored direct export channels to Asia, independent of Canadian mediation. They pursued renewable projects to diversify energy portfolios. They engaged with indigenous corporations to ensure local stakeholders shaped development. Adaptation became the watchword. The American public, meanwhile, oscillated between concern and fatigue. Global economic chess can feel distant until its effects register in employment statistics or commodity prices. Yet beneath everyday routines, tectonic plates were shifting. Trump's team leaned into symbolism. Visits to industrial sites, announcements of new exploration initiatives, meetings with energy executives broadcast as proof of momentum. Optics matter in moments of recalibration. Diplomatic channels with Canada intensified quietly. Trade representatives sought reassurances. Security cooperation remained intact. Military coordination in the Arctic continued. The complexity of modern alliances defies binary narratives. Beijing's financial institutions advanced credit lines tied to infrastructure expansion. Ports along the Pacific saw feasibility studies funded. Research exchanges expanded incrementally. The architecture of integration thickened. Alaska's strategic value sharpened in national discourse. Its proximity to Asia, its resource wealth, its role in missile defense, all converged into renewed focus. Federal policymakers spoke more frequently about Arctic stewardship and readiness. Trump framed the episode as validation of his long-standing warnings about global competition. He argued that complacency invites surprise. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the rhetoric resonated with voters who prize economic self-sufficiency. Yet the situation resisted simplification. Canada was not severing ties with Washington. China was not issuing ultimatums. Instead, the world was witnessing the fluid choreography of multipolar economics. Influence no longer flows exclusively in one direction. Energy CEOs in Alaska describe the moment as a pivot rather than a collapse. If one corridor narrows, others can widen. If one partner diversifies, so can another. Markets reward agility. Trump's messaging evolved subtly from indignation to mobilization. Rather than dwelling on perceived slights, he emphasized strategic investment, infrastructure, technology, resource development. The vocabulary shifted toward action. Still, the $780 billion figure lingered like a headline etched in steel. It symbolized both opportunity for Beijing and challenge for Washington. Numbers of that magnitude reshape expectations. In Canada, domestic debates intensified. Some lawmakers welcomed expanded access to Asian markets. Others cautioned about over-reliance. Balancing economic gain with strategic caution is a familiar dilemma for middle powers navigating superpower rivalry. Alaska's universities saw increased interest in Arctic research funding. Environmental scientists emphasized sustainable development as ice patterns evolve. Military strategists stress the importance of presence in high latitudes, the state's future intertwined with global currents. Trump's political opponents argued that diplomacy requires rebuilding trust. His allies contended that strength commands respect. The electorate observed both narratives, aware that outcomes matter more than framing. China's patience remained consistent. Economic ties matured gradually. Shipping contracts multiplied quietly. Each incremental step reinforced the initial commitment. Markets ultimately stabilized around a new baseline. Volatility receded, replaced by cautious recalibration. Investors adjusted portfolios to reflect emerging realities. In Alaska, employment figures held steady but fragile. Energy production continued, yet executives monitored demand shifts closely. Community leaders emphasized diversification beyond extractive industries, seeking resilience through technology and tourism. Trump's final messaging arc centered on resilience. He portrayed America as uniquely capable of reinventing itself under pressure. The storyline transformed from shock to challenge, from surprise to strategy. The broader lesson unfolding transcended personalities. In a globalized era, economic relationships are dynamic. Allies pursue advantage. Rivals seek opportunity. Stability emerges not from assumption but from continuous engagement. Alaska's horizon remains vast and icy, yet beneath its surface lie currents of commerce and strategy that connect continents. Whether this episode evolves into crisis or catalyst depends on decisions still unfolding. The $780 billion shift toward China did not detonate a collapse. It triggered introspection. It forced recalibration. It illuminated the delicate balance between partnership and competition in a world where capital flows faster than diplomacy. Trump's response, intense yet measured, signaled recognition that the contest is long-term. Beijing's composure signaled the same. Canada's pragmatism reflected its agency. History rarely resolves in a single headline. It evolves through sustained movement. And as North America adapts to shifting economic gravity, one truth becomes unmistakable. Influence in the 21st century belongs not to those who assume permanence, but to those who anticipate change and act before surprise becomes vulnerability. The world keeps turning. Contracts solidify. Ships depart. Pipelines hum. And in the quiet between headlines, strategies mature. Alaska watches. Washington recalibrates. Beijing advances patiently. Ottawa balances carefully. The story is not over. It is unfolding in real time, shaped by choices that will echo far beyond a single fiscal announcement. In that unfolding lies both risk and opportunity. The question is not whether the ground has shifted. It has. The question is who adapts fastest, who innovates boldly, and who understands that in a multipolar century, resilience is the ultimate currency.